Welcome to Eat, Drink, Think. I'm Amy O'Neill Hauk. In this podcast from Edible Communities, a network of magazines published across North America, we celebrate all things local and sustainable in the food world. Today, we're speaking with chef, author, and culinary historian Michael W. Twitty. Michael is the author of the two-time James Beard Award-winning book, The Cooking Gene. He's worked at Colonial Williamsburg, recreating the foodways from the colonial era. He writes widely and has been featured in national and international publications. In the opening to his new book, Recipes from the American South, he tells us, the South is not a monolith. Not state or area can provide the breadth of the Southern story or fully set the Southern table. The book, filled with over 250 recipes, introduces reader, cook, and eater to the depth and variation of Southern dishes, as well as the broad history and geography of Southern cooking. It's a delicious survey of Southern food, from biscuits to sweet tea, with generous helpings of corn, rice, stews, barbecue, and more in between. Michael, welcome to Eat, Drink, Think.
Well, thank you so much.
We're so glad you're here. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how it led you to write Recipes from the American South?
So Emily Takutis, one of the editors at Fiden, approached me about scouting out an author for this book. And I didn't have myself in mind. And what was really kind of, I talked to all the usual suspects. And, it's a really small world. It's a really small world. It's expansive, but it's pretty small. And nobody really wanted or had the time to do this project. This is a big project. And so I said, well, maybe I can partner with somebody. Still didn't really work out. And then it got down to the point where I was just like, well, maybe I could do this. And she said, well, I think you're the perfect person to do this. And that vote of confidence was really nice because this is not an easy project. Not to say that food memoir writing is easy. Food memoir writing, it takes a different kind of toll. The Cooking Gene, in that book, and it's, by the way, it's still out there, y'all. Go ahead and get your little copy and get it retail. Don't get it secondhand. Was me going across the planet, Africa, Europe, all across the South to find my roots. And, that's not an easy thing. And then I had to leave out certain stories because they would have been very interesting. But at the same point in time, they belong to me and my family. They don't belong to the world. And then personal narratives, they don't belong to the world. They belong to me. As I tell this version of Southern Black history, African American history, global African diaspora history, and European history and indigenous history that isn't told, it's told through these accomplishments in food and in diet and agriculture and stories of exploitation and emancipation all woven into one narrative. Then the Kosher Soul, which won the National Jewish Book Award, which I'm very proud to say I'm the first African American to do so. Also is about food, but also about my Jewish identity. And again, what do you keep in? What do you leave out? This is a different kind of challenge. This is, cookbooks are not easy, y'all. It's, especially when you know the cuisine, because in your mind, in your heart, and your soul, you are working on the recipe. And you, in real life, once you know something, you're going to innovate every time. You're going to improvise. At least I do. I can't speak for everybody. I do that. And so it's also what do you have on hand? What do you need? And when you mentioned me doing, historic interpretation through cooking, right? Well, that's also going to mean, what do I have that day? I mean, this idea of we go to the store or whatever is totally anathema to the art. The art is being as close to the circumstances, not the ingredient, the circumstances of that type of cooking, right? So now you have to officially say this much, that much, how long, this and that. And that's technique cooking. I'm not a technique person. I'm a context and feeling and vibing cooking person. So it forces you to have technique, order, precision to a certain degree. So I took this on as a challenge, but also knowing that it would be one of the first times that a solo African American author, particularly of Southern heritage, would be telling the story of all Southerners, of all backgrounds through food. Now, some people might say, well, what does that mean? As well, a lot of us do books that focus on the areas where we come from, or our families, or, the journey of soul food. This is about every Southern person, from Afro-Latin people to Cajun people to white Appalachian people to indigenous communities to Middle Eastern and Latino and Chinese communities in the Mississippi Delta and beyond. And so it's really, for me, it was a challenge on two paths. One was going from that kind of heart and hearth cooking where you're just like going on the feeling and you're not writing anything down, to actually getting it down and then having it vetted multiple times. And also the other part is making sure everybody's story, as much as you can, is covered and covered with respect.
Can you talk a little bit more about that process, about how you selected the recipes and decided which parts of those Southern pieces of culture that you wanted to include, and maybe who you talked to, that kind of thing?
Sure. For me, I guess the first part is, what am I doing here is a very different question. Now, we talked about how I got here. Well, how I got here was also traveling before the cooking gene became a thing, called the Southern Discomfort Tour, but also many other trips I had made, from the family, from tourism, from research across the American South. Which, by the way, everybody, I do not define in the sort of Confederate way. I define it as the census South, Maryland to Texas, Missouri to Florida. Okay, Kentucky included, West Virginia included, Oklahoma included. So now that we've said that part, you can, be upset if you want, but part of genealogy, my genealogy training is just learning about the migrations. You can't ignore migration patterns. Migration patterns mean that, the South does not begin at some fictional river or Mason-Dixon line. The South begins where the intersection of cultures happen. The South begins where migrations took people from, large hearth areas. What's a hearth area? A hearth area is a geographic core where culture and people and traditions happen. So that's a part of it as well. So, I've been traveling my whole life, learning about this my whole life, going to Africa 8 times, 8 different countries that represent a large swath of the population of African Americans, their roots in Africa, people who came to the South. It's seeing things in Africa that remind you of your Southern rural Black heritage. It's also, interacting with indigenous communities and going, okay, so what's a story, we need to tell here? What's going on? It's also going to parts of England, the British Isles, Germanic Europe, France, where you have these root cultures also come from. And it's a lifetime of reading books and listening and, being a child and listening to, listening to Natalie Dupree of late. May she rest in peace and power, and others tell this story. And now it's your turn, and it's like, tell us about Southern food. Okay, great. I got 400 years and, 40 plus years to tell you all about, right? So then you have to kind of select down and go, okay, just like a fashion designer, edit. What's gonna sing? How can you tell the story continuously without being repetitive? How can you introduce people without overwhelming them? And also, what's out there that you see that you're excited about, but you want to see more of? So, I'll give you a couple examples. I felt it was really important to show people that there are certain themes in Southern cooking that keep on going no matter what culture you come from. One really great example is the fritter. And so, for example, you have kala, beignet, and you have oreille de cochon, all from Louisiana. Pig's ears are a flour-based fritter where you top it with cane syrup and pecans. That's what they had. But, and I, even saying what they had, I don't mean, hard scrabble, make do. I mean, sort of just like, there's this, there's this incredible basic ingredients, right? Pecans come from the trees, cane syrup comes from the land. And, just the idea that you can make that terroir work and make it sing for you. Showing people the difference between okra soup and okra gumbo. That's important. Saying that, there's a Maryland crab cake, but then there's a Louisiana crab chop. Making sure people understand that burgoo, Brunswick stew, you kind of got to have all those recipes in it because they're similar, but they're not quite the same. They're telling different stories of migrations, people, individuals. Brunswick stew, for example, is not just the story of some innovation by people, men in particular. Brunswick stew is, as Ronnie Lundy eloquently put it, first and foremost belongs to the indigenous woman who cooked her own version, hundreds of years ago, if not thousands. And the other people added on to it later. Okay? And also constantly reiterating that narrative of indigenous African European. And you'll notice that constantly is my refrain, indigenous African European. Why? Indigenous was already here. African was working with 70,000 years of sustained human development. And European was sort of like looking in the background, trying to figure this out, and eventually relented to indigenous ingredients and, the know-how of Africans in the kitchen. And so I wanted to tell this story my way and tell it also with respect to the fact that when you come down to Latino people and Chinese people in Mississippi Delta, you're seeing these, it goes both ways. It's both those communities cooking things the way they know how, but also the receiving community borrowing from them. And so that kind of more than salt and pepper, more than just, harmonicas and three-legged dogs and banjos version of the South is really what I wanted to do because so typically, Southern food is just defined in terms of, oh, it's fried, it's unhealthy, it's this, it's cheesy and greasy and delicious, but actually kind of gross and all of this. And then, I'm looking outside of my garden as I talk to you and I'm just like, no, Southern food is, tons of fresh tomatoes and okra. And Southern food is hot peppers, off the plant and sweet potato vines growing everywhere and all these, and herbs and all these wonderful things. And, even Southern people, you had to convince them that the food is much more expansive. A lot of Southern people have gotten really used to the idea that Southern food is defined by the meat and three. You know what a meat and three is? You meat and entree and you get three little sides at, your favorite non-chain Southern restaurant or diner. Or it's, only certain foods, or it's not, oh, they didn't cook with all that. Well, you also have to remind people, Amy, that there are, not every food is available to every generation at every time, right? And so flavoring, I often use this example. In the time of Mary Randolph, who writes the first quote-unquote Southern cookbook, she has a very interesting history because she is, I don't know if Mary Randolph was actually that into being an enslaver because there was a lot of respect thrown at her by the enslaved Africans and African Americans around her. It's a very strange story. We don't have all the details of, but we know that, for example, Gabriel Prosser, who had an infamous rebellion, which was trying to free our people, said that he would let the abolitionists and the Quakers and the Frenchmen live, but above all, marry the queen of the kitchen. Very, very interesting narrative. Well, she's using rose water, vanilla, lemon zest. I mean, and then rosemary and sage and on and on and on and on and on. And different kinds of hot peppers. I mean, there's I think 20, 30 plus different kind of seasonings in her cookbook. Whereas if you're talking about those Depression era folks, who had to, really hunker down and deal with what they had. That's a very different type of Southern cooking. And so you have to somehow get those, wrestle all those recipes. And I will say this really quickly. I'm ashamed that I don't have fried okra in this cookbook. But I kind of forgot. Sorry, guys. I kind of forgot. It's a thing. But I don't. But this cookbook isn't supposed to be exhaustive. It's supposed to be representative, and those are two different words.
Seems like there's always going to be something missing when you're talking about a survey of an
Always.
entire culture or entire collection of cultures. You talked a little bit about how Southern people think of Southern cooking, and that made me wonder, did you have an audience person in mind or reader in mind when you were writing? And was that a Southern reader, or was that a reader from, North America, or what were you imagining?
So you Fiden books are international books. So you learn quickly that you're not just writing for people who may have a clue or know even a stereotype. They may have no idea at all. So you're writing more like less of this is my American subculture, and writing more like, hey world, this is us. I had to read through before I even started the research for the cookbook in terms of what I'm going to include and what the boundaries will be. I had to research how other writers for fighting represented their culture, a culture, and that was really daunting because I think the Latin American cookbook in particular was just like really, really super thorough. A Palestinian cookbook very, brought you into the realm of Palestinian regional cooking, even though it's a very small part of the world. And so on and so on. Japan. Japanese cooking and Southern cooking are not the same thing, and Japanese cooking comes with, a couple thousand years of thought behind it. We're just beginning. Southern cooking compared to Japanese cooking is it's baby, right? It's a child, it's an infant. But at the same point in time, it's a very developed infant, a very strong infant, almost a mythical infant. And Southern people themselves, who really do love the food. I remember this story from I forget was it Carson McCullough and was it William Faulkner? I know it was at least William Faulkner and somebody else, Eudora Welty, somebody, Southern writers, and they're supposed to be sitting at a cafe in Rome, and instead of like regaling in the fact that they are these living this very privileged, interesting life, I think one says, butter beans are in back home and blackberries too, she said wistfully. I love that because it really speaks to the fact that Southern people, if you're really into this, if you're really about it, and when I say about it and into it, I mean, what farmers market to go to. You know what the land's going to do when you start. You get excited about planting things in January. All the what kind of fish you're looking for when you go fishing. Whether it's drum or weak fish or sakale, gaspagoo, Wymount. See, those are all Southern terms for specific fish that you're not going to find and I had to like say, so for example, I kind of like had to push for using scientific names because honestly, because of the nerd I am, that is really the only way internationally to be able to identify a species, floral and faunal. That excites me because it's more than just generic. And of course, what is brim to a Southerner is not the same as brim to a European. You have to be you got to be very specific about what you're saying and what you're describing. So I wrote this book with, an English speaking reading audience in mind that would also be able be invited into the fact that Southern people have our own language around food. And it's also dialectical and regional, but It has its own stories to tell. We don't just say, I'm gonna give you okra and rice. We say I'm gonna give you limp and Susan. We don't just say I'm gonna give you black eyed peas or Philippines or because I'm Hop and John. I'm not just saying I'm gonna give you this sweet um, con- confection, but not confection, but bread, and we call it Sally Lunn, right? So this constant sort of like I invite the reader in and say, we nickname our food so much the way we nickname other our people. You know, one of the best jokes about Southern familyhood is that you don't know who the hell these people actually are. They got three, four different names that they're known in different circles, and the same thing goes with the food. Like people kind of get hung up on them. Like, don't get hung up. These we love our food so much that it's our family, and just like our family, we give it names of endearment.
So, this book is filled with recipes and then also lots of fun tidbits drizzled in along the way. I especially loved your description of yourself as a kid standing in defense of your grandmother's bread in full regalia. And I thought it was interesting that you opened the book with baking. And we already talked about beignets and other fried dough confections, but also, if I counted correctly, maybe 5 recipes for biscuits. Can you talk about baking
Mhm.
and biscuits and their importance in Southern cooking?
You are supposed to be able, as a Southern cook. Now, I'm not going to go the sexist route, which would be, if you want to get married, you got to make that bread right. You got to make biscuits right. You got to make coffee and do the chicken right. Make gumbo right. We're not going to go there because that's not where I'm located. But cat head biscuits. No, there's no actual cat head involved. Cat head biscuits are a sort of kind of rough, huge biscuit that you could make into a sandwich, or you could fill with a lot of jam or preserves or honey, whatever you want. Versus beaten biscuits, which are an old school hardtack. They are not the same. So if you imagine these people sitting around between 1750 and 1920 eating beaten biscuits, and they're going to be lovely. No, no, no. You have to eat them very hot and very fresh, and they're not meant to taste like a buttermilk biscuit. Okay, beaten biscuits were basically a quick way. You had the dough already there. You kept on whacking it 1,000 times. And I should mention that Natalie Dupree caught my attention when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, watching her show. And I actually got to meet her and hang out with her and go to her house when way later in life, which was kind of wild, and talk at length with her. She was very supportive of me and my work. And it was, as we say in Yiddish, a beschikt. It was fated. It was supposed to be. And, she said, a young black child, often a boy, would sit in and beat this dough 1,000 times. Well, representation matters because I'm listening to her talk about this on her show New Southern Cooking back in the '80s, and going, that would have been me. That would have been me. So what does that mean? And so there's these biscuits. I don't care if they're, um, you know, the ones we do from self-rising flour and buttermilk, or the biscuits that we make that go with chicken gravy in the skillet, fried biscuits. I mean, biscuits, cornbread rolls. And by the way, y'all, I used to froth at the mouth when I would do like historic interpretation. People say, "Oh my God, look at those biscuits." I'm like, these are rolls. These are 3 to 4 hours. Biscuits are 20, 30 minutes. Get it right. The timing that it takes, the energy. And when I would do actually beaten biscuits, I would have kids take their turn using the large roller to beat the flour. And they would maybe do it about 20 to 50 times and be like, I'm tired. I'm like, imagine if you do it 1,000. Giving them that experience, which I love. I love getting kids excited about history because that was me, right? So I want to pass it on. But as I think about this and as your question, It's just like I started with the thing that I think for a lot of Southern cooks is culturally the basis of, can you cook at all? Can you make bread? Can you make, we lived for generations, we lived on good bread, good cornbread, different kinds of mush and starches and bases, sweet potato rolls, sweet potato biscuits, that et cetera, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Long before we got to the cakes and the desserts, which, is, which I need to give Nancy McDermott a shout out. Nancy McDermott has been a friend of mine for years, ever since I started this journey. And she's also a master at cakes and pies. And without her, I couldn't have done that huge section. I mean, we really went through it, and her expertise was essential. I'm not a baker. I do bake, but my cakes and my pies are not going to be these artful things. They're going to be nice. They're going to taste really good, but I can't tell you how to make them. And so I had to work with Nancy to kind of like, okay, now how do I tell them how to do this and do that? So the baking part is really important because it's the heart of Southern domesticity.
So you talked about your garden a few minutes ago, and the book is coming out in October, a bit past gardening season in my northern neck of the woods. But as you acknowledge, in the South, there's an 8 to 10 month growing season. I'm curious, what are your favorite things to grow? And do you have a favorite vegetable recipe in the book?
Wow. Okay, so I have three different kinds of sweet potatoes coming out of the ground by October 31st. And we're still actually pushing on. We're gonna that's greens time. Greens should have already been seeded and planted, but they will go into the winter, and sometimes they'll, keep on till January, February, and there's a little bit of a lag, and then there's March, and you start all over again. We have carrots coming in that time. We have cucumbers coming in that time that are late, and also this year I'm going to do a short season cucumber from Alaska. So I'm really going for varieties that are typically grown in areas where you only have a short growing season of maybe even 2 to 3 months. And I'm trying it all this fall. But of course, they'll be charred and there'll be all kinds of different kinds of collard greens. Just every sort of bit of, okay, so, how can we extend the season without going too crazy? So yeah, we have more okra coming. Okra's going to be going till frost. It's already a lot. Tomatoes will probably go till frost. I'm learning how to can for the first time this year. Don't tell nobody. And so all of that, but it's going to be soon time for me to go out there and start clipping herbs and drying them in mass. That's a big deal, especially sage. Sage because I make turkey sausage, and sage goes in the cornbread dressing. I wish I liked eggplant. I don't. I don't grow it, which was called in the old South Guinea squash because, there were varieties that came from West Africa to the South. A favorite vegetable, I would say the plat de Haiti fruit. It's a variety of tomato and a Cherokee purple. And I love making, all sorts of like Creole and Caribbean dishes with the plat de Haiti tomato. And I love making marinara with the Cherokee purple. I enjoy okra, corn, and tomatoes a lot. A lot. And I'm going to try to make that as much as I can before you can't get reasonable sweet corn anymore, which will come up pretty quickly. So for me, all of that's really important. And I don't want to fool anybody. I didn't always like all this stuff growing up. I really was trending towards the picky non-vegetable eater. And, not having a lot will teach you the value, the glory and value of a fresh vegetable on your plate. I have I have different kinds of heirloom field peas out there as well. So I have the whole thing in bush beans. Oh Lord, I can't wait for my green beans to show up. Because we have a way with them. We have a way with smoked meat and bones and onion and just a little bit of something here and there, and throwing it in and making these glorious beans. I could eat beans, green beans like that every day. I can't stand canned green beans. I can't stand frozen green beans. I got to have them fresh. I got to be on a porch, which I have, thank you God, to, snap them like my mother did, my grandmother did, her mother before her. That's just, and also I should mention this, my grandfather, my father's father, was one of the founding members of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which helped black farmers stay on the land. And it's very difficult for me to not be in my, gardener farmer space and not think about granddaddy, but also know that he learned from his father, his father, his father. And I can tell you their names going back 6 generations. And so for me, that's all a part of my work. I mean, I'm so sorry. I can't be a cultural, a political, a spiritual, about this. It isn't just about the stomach and the tongue. It's about the whole process, the legacy that we leave and the legacy that we pass on, but also the fun we have in developing our own tastes and our own foodscapes in our own lifetimes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that comes through in the stories and the introduction to recipes. So this seems like a great lead into the section about soups, stews, and casseroles, because you talk a lot there about how the one-pot meal's popularity is really tied to community and to meal sharing. Can you talk about that communal eating as a part of Southern culture and maybe tell us about a recipe or two that are essential to this style of cooking?
Yeah. So nobody just, these recipes are for a home kitchen, but to be honest with you, very few people make a pot of Brunswick stew just for their family. Southern food communalizes. And that's because it's based on the cuisine of indigenous people, African people, and European peasants for whom communal eating is part of the glue of society. As much, and also it's one of the few cuisines where the sort of high on the hog cooking, the high of upper society cooking, is about massive hospitality entertaining. Massive. Like to the, thousands of this, hundreds of this, barbecues for 1,500 people, dinner parties for 30 and 40, but not the dinner party that we know, but like the groaning table. And so, gumbo, for example, is not only just seasonal, but the gumbo you serve at a wedding or at a christening or during, Lent or during different types of hunting season will change. That doesn't even stay the same. And so there's this constant sort of like shift. And what somebody feeds you and how they feed you tells you a lot about them. For example, a mess of greens, having 7, gumbo zeb in Louisiana and a mess of greens in other parts of the South, having the more greens, the more friends, the more good luck, the more, conviviality. So this is it's one of the few cuisines in North America that has a fully fledged folklore behind it. It's a lot of F's. Alliteration's great. So you have all these different pieces that come together just to make a meal. And I want people to realize that and respect that there's such an intellectual component of all these mental facts that go behind Southern food. The king's cake tradition with the infant inside, all these other things. I mean, there's so much of it that you could even just write a book about Southern food, traditions without a recipe included. Just you're making people understand that. Or that, for different people, different foods have different meanings and different proverbs and folklore behind them. And that's just really exciting to me. That one pot meal is a big point of contention, by the way, among cultural historians, archaeologists as well. Some people make the point, well, this is this kind of food or this kind of food. And they're both right. It is both specific to the groups that came to the South, but also can be a universal. And in a region where race and exploitation and histories of genocide and enslavement and subjugation, and I would include in that, to some extent, the stories and lives of white women and white severely impoverished white folks, and immigrants as well. When you have all those narratives put together, it's strange. It's almost a Southern paradox that the same cuisine that does reflect those dark histories, which I don't shy away from in this book, also reflects that if we were put on Mars, we would have that in common. That would be our subject of conversation. I've seen it in New York. I've seen it in LA when two people from, you know, respective regions of the South meet each other and they're the aliens. They're the odd ones out. They do, they reach for those areas. And oftentimes it will begin by somebody saying something like, oh, you said that kind of word, or you said, yes, sir, no, ma'am. Where you from? Where you people from? And these people may not have anything else in common or agree on much else, but they know what a good biscuit tastes like. They know what fresh greens taste like. They know about that bottle of hot sauce made from the Sprite bottle on the table. They know about what good catfish is, et cetera, et cetera. So that's that kind of communalism, communalizing force is what I wanted to really document through that section and others.
Yeah. Well, your talk of the hot sauce made me think about the seasoning and sauce section of the book, which is where I often get nerdy when I'm looking at a cookbook. And I got really curious about kitchen pepper, which is a spice blend that you reference a few times throughout. And can you tell us about it? And you nod a little bit to its history in the book, but can you tell us about it and tell us if it's still something that's in common use today?
Well, I've helped popularize it. I know a number of our entrepreneurs and young folks have created their own blends of kitchen pepper. No, I mean, when I say that I popularized it and I said that I put it back out there, it's not about a pat on the back. It's about realizing what I've done in this space. And, kitchen pepper was like the best kept secret of people who did living history and did historical cooking. If you know the quatrepi, the four spices, right, from French cooking, but also the recognition that kitchen pepper was kind of like the seasonal of the colonial and early 19th century through the Civil War. So kitchen pepper can be many things, but in my world, it's black pepper, white pepper, even sometimes red pepper, ginger, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, sometimes in mace, allspice, etc. And I even have one through Spice Tribe, out of San Francisco, organic and, no salt, no whatever. And people love it. People love it. And I often include it in recipes, especially the older ones. You can choose to put black pepper, you can choose to put kitchen pepper. But I think that when you put kitchen pepper into a recipe, you're getting a small taste of the Old South. You're getting a small taste of, because sometimes people said pepper in books. They didn't always just mean black pepper. They could mean red pepper. They could mean kitchen pepper or whatever. And that's really critical to mention to people that often words don't have the same meaning across generations for certain ingredients. And having said that, now that we've put that out there, kitchen pepper definitely gives a kind of I don't know, when you throw some kitchen pepper in some red eye gravy, or you have some in cornbread dressing, if you use it subtly, it's going to give you all types of journeys that you didn't expect to go on, and people will eat the food going, "Oh, this is interesting. I can't really, put my finger on what this is." And the God's truth is you ain't supposed to. You come to my kitchen, you come to anybody else's kitchen, is a good cook. You ain't supposed to know every little thing that goes into the thing and be able to discern. And no, it's about having the fun of discovery and also magic. There is no magic when you know everything. Magic is also imagination. Magic is also transporting people without telling them. So I love kitchen pepper for that reason. Now that I've kind of like burst my bubble on that secret, um, I have to kind of figure out something else to do. But I'm really proud of that. Fish peppers and which are Merlin heirloom, hot pepper and kitchen pepper, and using things, spice bush, other wild forage things to flavor food. Like was what like at one point was done all the time. That's exciting. And I mean, of course, a lot of cooks, make their mark with these special ingredients. But for me, also, I want people to go, huh, fish peppers. Where do I get that? Oh, I guess I got to order that and grow it. You damn right you do. Because I want you to have delayed gratification, patience. I want you to talk to your ancestors. I want you to talk to your children and the people, young people around you who you have influence on. I want you to engage in these larger, mega, you know, areas of life and existence, of existentialism to cook. I don't want you to just worry about what can I eat for dinner tonight. Because that's what historians do, right? We invite people to time travel with their minds, and in my case, with their stomachs too.
Okay, you just gave me the best lead into my last question, which is I'm curious, is there a cook from history that you wish you could spend time with in the kitchen? So if you want to
Edna
think about that for a
Lewis.
second. Okay, so Edna Lewis, and what would you guys make together?
So Edna Lewis was known as the grand dame of Southern cooking. And what's important about her, and I should really say this in light of some recent revivalism regarding Edna Lewis. For me, Edna Lewis is important not just because I always tell people, I said, people said there was one Edna Lewis, but Edna Lewis would have told you, no, there's many Edna Lewises. They just don't have books. She told my friend and mentor, Tony Tipton Martin, leave no stone unturned. Don't just focus on the few, but get everybody's story that you can do. Also, she represents the sort of Virginia way of cooking that people don't know this, but Edna Lewis lived in the same cultural universe as James Hemings of Monticello's sake, of Montpelier in Orange County, Virginia, where she was from. I mean, all these, Mary Randolph, they're all sort of in the same sort of regional cultural family tree. But another thing is that she's cooking from this central Virginia upper South food tradition, which was actually pretty widespread with her specific way of doing it. But another narrative is, as you know, I'm a queer man, I'm a gay man, and Edna Lewis's journey was heavily influenced by her interactions with queer men, including Truman Capote and many others. Tennessee Williams, and that impacts Scott Peacock, who took care of her in the later years. And so for me, understanding that and having all those different pieces, because I am Virginia heritage, I am black, I am Southern heritage, I am a gay man. Um, I guess when we ask the question, who would we want to cook with? It's like, well, do I have permission? If I could ask the questions I want to ask and cook with them, and be that fly on the wall, or actually learn from them, and just sit in awe and watch my mouth and just be respectful and just understand that I'm in a magic space. And so you have to do that when you go to the cookbooks. And so you read them. Joy of Country Cooking I've had that book for years. Now I have multiple copies. The pristine copy, the copy that I write in and read and reread and reread. We have a saying in Judaism that, you can turn the Torah and Torah and turn it, and it'll always be a new Torah. The same way you read all the stuff that Edna did. She wrote several beautiful cookbooks. I blurbed one of them, long after she'd passed. And, you know, you're sitting there with these books and you're asking questions of these cooks that you can't reach anymore. Maybe you can reach them, but they're difficult to reach. So Edna would be the first choice, and the second would be everybody's buddy and everybody's friend. Leah Chase, I actually got to meet her several times and talk with her, and she was just the coolest lady. One time, she had many relatives, and one of her daughters, granddaughters, somebody had come to a presentation I was doing out at Whitney Plantation, which tells the story of slavery through the lens of the enslaved. And I was going to make filet gumbo, and I had no filet. And she said, then at that same trip, I came to her restaurant, and another relative was kind of gatekeeping, and I was at least thought it was just somebody. And she had a lot of fans, and she knew I was around, and by the time she was in a wheelchair. And before her relative could say, well, you know what? You're going to have to sit down, I heard, Twitty! From the kitchen. So I came back. She said, you better give grandma a hug. I'm not her grandchild, but it's as if she had like a million grandchildren. She really had that relationship. And she said to me, now she gave me, I got the hug and the kiss. Then she like gently pushed me away and she said, now look, I heard that you were trying to make filet gumbo, but you had no filet. What's the problem, man? And she said, you young people, she said, y'all always want to go and learn some cordon bleu, but grandma going to teach you a little cordon noir. I never forgot that. And it made me feel so like welcome and warm. But also she always would give you like culinary tips and tricks and things. And I mean, she was so brilliant, so smart, but she never called herself a chef. She said, I'm just a cook. Wild, right? But, if I could cook with her, I saw a picture of her with Edna Lewis, with Chef Joe Randall. And I thought, oh my God, what would that have been like to cook with these two? And they don't speak, they have the same reference points, but the same culinary language. Okay? So that would be my choice. I mean, I could go on. If you really want to dig a lot, but I don't have time to go over it, I would also say James Hemmings. Edna's closer to me, but James Hemmings, who was the star chef at Monticello, who learned a lot of his craft in France as a young man, who had an extraordinary and tragic end. James is also, when Patrick Henry says that Thomas Jefferson's table was half Virginian and half French in style, served in good taste and abundance, we know what he means by Virginian. He means Afro-Virginian. And to Edith Fawcett and Fanny Hearn, who then take up the next generation of cooking at Monticello, these women who were French trained on this side of the ocean. Extraordinary, people. And to sit with them and talk with them is why I do my work, right? This cookbook, The Cooking Gene, the book I did on rice, it really is sort of like the same kind of work we do with, rabbinic literature. It's just this constant sort of dialogue with the past, but also for the sake of giving the future something to hug on to, and zealously guard, and never stop doing, never stop touching, never stop cooking. That's me.
Well, that's great. Now we have recipes from the American South, and we can join you in the kitchen.
I love it. That's, now that you said that, that gave me a whole different perspective.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, that's my pleasure. I am so proud that this community has outreach to me, and I'm so proud to be able to share my stories with you. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Michael Twitty, chef, historian, and author of Recipes from the American South. Thank you for joining us today at Eat.Drink.Think. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to pick up your local edible magazine. You can find show notes for today's episode at ediblecommunities.com.